already told you everything I know.
We're just trying to pin down the timeline, man.
I've given you the timeline 3 times. You're not listening.
We're listening. How about one more pass just to be sure?
Over the course of 6 years, 13 people in Houston died from causes believed to be natural, with no signs of abnormalities, and each case was treated as an isolated incident. But when the records were put together, one name kept appearing before their deaths, raising the question: was it a coincidence or a disturbing pattern that had never been uncovered? The case began to attract attention when authorities in the state of Texas decided to reopen several death records that had seemingly been closed for many years. These files had previously been processed according to standard procedures and showed no indication that a criminal investigation was necessary. In each individual case, doctors recorded the cause of death as related to health problems or medical complications, and therefore the cases were quickly concluded as natural deaths. However, the reason these old files were reviewed again did not originate from the crime scene or from forensic reports, but rather from a financial review. During a routine audit, a bank in the area discovered several notable transactions in the account of a customer who had died many years earlier. Under normal procedures, the accounts of deceased individuals are usually closed or transferred to the legal heirs within a relatively short period of time. Therefore, the appearance of transactions after the time of death prompted the Internal Control Department to conduct a more thorough examination. At first, the situation was considered an isolated case of financial fraud. However, as the data review expanded, bank employees realized that this case was not the only one. Several other accounts in the same area, also belonging to individuals who had died many years earlier, showed suspicious transactions occurring after the time of death. These transactions were not large, but they were enough to trigger the risk control systems and require further verification. The report of these unusual transactions was then forwarded to the authorities for review in accordance with regulations. When investigators began comparing the list of these account holders with death records in the area, they noticed a detail that required closer examination. These deaths had occurred at different times, stretching across many years, yet they were concentrated within the same geographic area. At that point, each individual case alone was still not enough to raise clear suspicion. In a large city, it is completely normal for many people to pass away at different times. However, when the files were placed side by side for comparison, investigators began to notice several notable similarities. Most of the victims lived relatively independently or had limited regular support from family members. Some were going through personal difficulties such as financial problems, major life changes, or social isolation. These circumstances made it harder for people around them to notice changes in their lives. More importantly, when investigators began reviewing the personal relationships that had appeared in the victims' lives before they died, a detail started to repeat across multiple files. In the period before the victim's health began to decline, one name appeared among their personal contacts. At first, this detail was recorded only as a minor coincidence. However, as the number of files being examined increased, the repetition of this detail made investigators unable to continue treating it as random. Death cases that had seemed scattered over many years began to suggest the possibility that a common connection might exist. At that point, the initial review related to financial transactions began to shift direction. Investigators expanded the scope of their examination to include medical records, communication histories, and the social relationships of those who had died. When these data were placed side by side, a pattern gradually emerged, a pattern that could not be recognized if each case was viewed individually. What had previously been considered independent death cases, occurring sporadically over many years, now began to show signs of a sequence of events that might be connected. And when the pieces from multiple files were placed together, investigators realized that they might be facing a story completely different from what had been recorded in the original reports. A chain of events that had unfolded quietly over many years began to gradually come to light. A chain of events that previously no one had enough reason to recognize, while each case still stood separately within its own file. The victims in this case did not know each other. Daniel Harper was the first to be mentioned when investigators began reviewing the death records in the area. After a prolonged divorce and many years of tension in his personal life, he moved to live alone in a small house in the suburbs of Houston. Neighbors only occasionally saw him going out to shop or tending to the garden in front of his house. Daniel's life seemed to pass rather quietly as he tried to start over, staying away from the upheavals of the past. A few months later, the local community heard news of another case. Rachel Kim, the owner of a small bakery located on a corner near the city center, passed away under circumstances recorded as related to health issues. Rachel was known to many regular customers as a friendly woman who always smiled when serving them. However, aside from her work at the bakery, her personal life was quite private, and she had almost no family members living in the area. Not long after that, another name appeared in the list of death records: Arthur Wells. He was a retired man living alone in his old house after his wife had passed away a few years earlier. Neighbors described Arthur as a rather quiet person. He rarely left the neighborhood and spent most of his time at home or taking slow walks around the nearby area. Over time, the list of names associated with death cases in the area began to grow longer. Monica Alvarez, a woman facing financial difficulties after losing her job and struggling to maintain her life on her own. Stephen Cole, a truck driver who frequently traveled between different cities and spent most of his time living in short-term rental apartments, rarely staying connected to any particular community for long. Next was Patricia Gomez, a part-time sales employee living in a small apartment in the southern part of the city. People who knew her said Patricia lived a simple and rather private life, spending most of her time on work and personal routines. Leonard Brooks, a military veteran, was also among those listed. After leaving the service, he lived quite separately from those around him and rarely took part in community activities. Emily Sanders was one of the people who had moved to Houston not long before her death. She came to the city hoping to start over after several personal difficulties in the past. However, rebuilding a new life in an unfamiliar place was not always easy. Then there was Victor Nguyen, the owner of a small electronics repair shop in a residential area. Although he had stable work, Victor was known as someone who lived quite apart from his family and rarely participated in social relationships around him. Thomas Reed, an older man, continued living in his old house after his children had moved to live in other states. Most of the time, he stayed at home alone and occasionally received phone calls from family members checking on him. Olivia Turner, who worked freelance with an irregular schedule, was also among the names. Because of the nature of her work, she rarely maintained stable social relationships and spent most of her time working alone. Brian Walsh, a warehouse employee at a local company, lived quietly in an old apartment complex. People living in the same building said they only occasionally saw Brian in the elevator or in the parking area. And finally, there was Catherine Doyle, a middle-aged woman who lived quite withdrawn after many hardships in her life. After going through major changes in her family, Catherine seemed to choose a quiet life with little interaction with the people around her. It was not until the review process moved into a more detailed stage that investigators noticed a common point that had previously gone unnoticed. When they began comparing the files again from communication histories, to the people who had appeared in the victims' lives, to their personal relationships in the period before they died, one name gradually began to emerge in multiple cases. At first, the appearance of this name was recorded only as a minor detail in the files. In any community, it is not uncommon for many people to know the same person. But as investigators continued expanding the scope of their review to include more files, the repetition of that name began to appear with increasingly noticeable frequency. In many cases, this woman had appeared in the victims' lives not long before their health suddenly began to decline. In some instances, these were only casual social meetings. In other cases, the relationship appeared closer, involving help with personal matters or assistance in handling certain financial paperwork. If each file was viewed separately, the presence of this woman did not raise suspicion. There were no reports of conflict, no disputes, and no signs of tension were recorded in those relationships. But when investigators placed all of the files side by side and marked the times when this name appeared, a pattern began to emerge. The coincidence did not occur just once or twice, but repeated across multiple cases over many years. It was this repetition that gradually turned the investigators' initial curiosity into suspicion. From that point on, investigators began tracing every detail related to this woman, from the places she had lived, to the people she had known, and to the ways she had appeared in the lives of multiple victims. And when the data were placed side by side, every path seemed to lead to the same person. That woman was Laura Mitchell. Laura moved to Houston a few years before the death records in the area began to attract attention again. She rented a small apartment in the southern part of the city in a relatively quiet residential area and lived a fairly private life. To many people around her, Laura was simply a woman living alone who rarely attracted attention. Neighbors in the building knew very little about her other than occasionally seeing her walking through the hallway, carrying shopping bags from a nearby store, or leaving the building in the morning. There were no large gatherings, no notable social activities, and nothing in particular that made her the center of attention in the neighborhood. From the outside, Laura's life seemed to pass rather quietly and simply. Laura also did not have a fixed job in the usual sense. When asked about her work, she often said that she helped some acquaintances handle matters related to personal finances or assisted them in organizing necessary paperwork. Sometimes this involved reviewing financial records, helping fill out forms, or guiding them on how to complete certain administrative procedures. These tasks were not connected to any specific office or company. Most of them were carried out through personal relationships or people she knew in the area. Because of this, for many people around her, Laura's work was somewhat difficult to clearly define. However, the way she described her work was still enough to make everything appear completely normal in the eyes of those who had interacted with her. In appearance, Laura was quite simple. She dressed plainly, spoke softly, and rarely attracted attention wherever she appeared. People who had met her usually only remembered a quiet and polite woman. However, many people who had interacted with Laura shared the same impression. She gave a strong sense of trustworthiness. Laura was not someone who talked much about herself, but she was particularly good at listening to other people's stories. In conversations, she often allowed the other person to speak more, occasionally asking questions just enough to show her interest. She remembered small details that others shared, asked about them at appropriate moments, and always maintained a calm and composed demeanor. This style of communication quickly made many people feel comfortable around her. In a community where many people lived alone or did not have family nearby, the presence of someone willing to listen and offer help could sometimes become more important than people realized. And over time, Laura gradually became a familiar presence in the lives of several residents who lived rather privately in the area. After Laura gradually became a familiar presence in the lives of several residents who lived alone in the area, unexplained health incidents began to appear in a scattered but repeating pattern. At first, these events did not attract any particular attention. They occurred months apart, sometimes even years apart, and each case was recorded as an individual health incident. It was precisely the time gaps between these events that prevented anyone from seeing the whole picture. Each death was recorded in a separate file, at a different time and under circumstances that seemed completely independent. However, when these files were reviewed again many years later, investigators realized that many cases shared notable similarities. In most cases, everything seemed to begin in a very similar way. A person who had previously been living normally, with no signs of serious illness, suddenly began to experience prolonged fatigue. At first, the symptoms were described as ordinary weakness, the body becoming weaker, a loss of appetite, or an unusual feeling of exhaustion. But within a relatively short period of time, their health condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Some people had to be hospitalized when the symptoms became more severe. In other cases, they died at home before they could receive full medical care. Doctors recorded many signs related to the decline of organ function or complex medical complications. However, during the initial examinations, there were no signs indicating outside interference. No injuries, no signs of violence, no signs of struggle at the scene. Routine medical tests also did not detect any clear factors suggesting intentional harm. Therefore, in each individual case, doctors concluded that the cause of death could be related to natural health issues or unpredictable medical complications. And because each case was handled independently according to standard procedures, the files were quickly closed. There was no suspicious crime scene, no signs of a crime, no reason to open a criminal investigation. For the people around them, each death was simply a personal tragedy, a sad story that happened in the life of an individual person. But what no one realized at the time was that these events were not as separate as they seemed. They occurred sporadically over many years, spaced far enough apart that no one could see the entire chain of events, while each case remained in its own file. Only when investigators placed all of those files side by side many years later did a pattern gradually begin to emerge, a pattern that had previously been hidden by the very separation in time between each event. Everything truly changed when a bank in the area conducted an internal review and discovered unusual transactions in the account of a customer who had died many years earlier. At first, This was considered an isolated case of financial fraud. However, when they investigated further, they realized that several other accounts, also belonging to individuals who had died in the same area, had shown suspicious transactions after the time of death. A quiet review began. Investigators compared the list of these account holders with death records in the area over many previous years. When they placed the names side by side, they noticed something that made them pause. Most of these individuals had personal connections with the same person, Laura, during the period before their health began to decline. At first, that detail seemed like only a small common point. But as the number of cases increased, the repetition could no longer be considered random. From a financial suspicion, the review quickly expanded to include medical records and communication histories. And for the first time, investigators began asking whether the deaths scattered over many years were truly independent, or merely the surface of a sequence of events that had been carefully concealed. Some biological samples preserved from earlier death cases were later re-examined using more modern analytical methods than those available when the cases were originally concluded. Thanks to advances in forensic technology, these samples that had been stored in older case files could now be tested with greater accuracy. The analysis revealed traces of a toxic substance, cyanide, in several of the samples. This is a poison capable of causing serious damage to internal organs if used in small doses over a certain period of time. In many cases, if the dosage is not large and the initial tests focus only on common health causes, traces of this substance may not be detected at the beginning. This discovery immediately caused a significant shift in the direction of the investigation. Deaths that had previously been recorded as natural health issues now had to be reconsidered from a completely different perspective. Symptoms that had once been attributed to physical weakness or medical complications began to be viewed in a new context when the possible presence of a toxic substance was taken into account. For investigators, these forensic findings raised a possibility far more serious than the initial assumptions. If these traces were indeed related to the causes of death, it would mean that the events that had occurred over many years might not have been isolated cases. Instead, behind the chain of incidents that had unfolded quietly over many years, there might have been a deliberate act carried out and carefully concealed. After several internal discussions, the investigative authorities decided to invite this woman for an official interview to clarify the related details. It was no longer a routine conversation, but a necessary step in an investigation that was beginning to reveal its true scope. Laura Mitchell was invited to meet with investigators. During many hours of questioning, she remained calm and cooperative. She stated that she had only helped friends with financial matters and paperwork. However, when confronted with evidence related to the timing of her presence in the victims' lives and the financial transactions that occurred after their deaths, the silence began to grow longer. Investigators realized that the story behind these seemingly ordinary relationships was far more complex than it appeared. In the following weeks, the investigation expanded at a faster pace and with far greater detail than during the initial review stage. Biological samples preserved from several previous death records were sent again for examination using modern technology. The analysis revealed traces of the same toxic substance appearing in multiple cases, a substance that is difficult to detect when used in small doses and does not leave clear signs in routine medical tests. At the same time, the financial records of the victims were carefully examined. Investigators discovered unusual changes involving account authorization, withdrawal transactions, or adjustments to beneficiary information occurring shortly before or after the victims died. When compared with Laura's transaction and purchase history, the timelines began to align in notable ways. Each individual piece of evidence might not have been enough to draw a conclusion, but when everything was placed together with forensic results, financial data, and the repeating timelines, a chain of evidence gradually formed. At that point, suspicion was no longer based on intuition or coincidence, but on a system of evidence steadily tightening around the center of the case. After collecting sufficient evidence from multiple sources, authorities proceeded with the arrest of Laura Mitchell. The trial that followed attracted significant public attention as prosecutors presented the entire chain of events that had unfolded over many years. Financial records, communication data, and forensic examination results played a crucial role in reconstructing the full sequence of events. After many days of trial and the review of all the evidence presented in court, the jury concluded that the actions carried out in this case were premeditated and not events that occurred by chance. Prosecutors presented a chain of evidence showing that the acts involved multiple victims over a period of many years, meeting the criteria for first-degree murder under Texas law. During deliberations, the jury paid particular attention to the repeated timelines, financial data, and forensic examination results presented during the trial. When all of these elements were placed together, they determined that what had happened was not a series of isolated health incidents, but a sequence of deliberate actions carried out with intent. Given the severity of the case and the number of victims involved, the court decided to sentence Laura Mitchell to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This means that she will spend the remainder of her life in prison and will have no opportunity to be released in the future. The verdict brought closure to one of the most shocking cases in the region in many years and put an end to a chain of events that had unfolded quietly for a long time. After many years during which the incidents appeared scattered and unnoticed, the full story was finally revealed before the court. The story in this video is based on a real case in Vietnam involving the suspect Luton Van, who was once referred to by the media as the poison killer after a series of poisoning acts against multiple victims shocked the public. The content has been reconstructed with the purpose of providing information, analyzing the investigative process, and offering an educational perspective on criminal psychology. Was justice truly carried out for the 13 victims in this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more notable crime cases. Through cases like this, we hope viewers can better understand how investigators follow even the smallest details to uncover the truth, while also recognizing the serious consequences of actions that remain hidden over long periods of time and the importance of vigilance in everyday life.